Hello everybody, and welcome to episode 4 of ScholAceStic, a podcast where I help you ace your scholastic pursuits. Today I'm going to discuss various study techniques and what has and hasn't worked for me, and why. Let's get into it. So I believe I hinted at this in my previous episode, but I am a die-hard flashcard user. I've used flashcards for memorization since 6th grade. This is just the study method that's always worked best for me, and while I've experimented with other study methods, I've always come back to this one. Now, it's not always feasible to make flashcards to study every subject. When it came to things like math and physics, I would use flashcards to memorize equations and their purposes, but for the most part, I studied those subjects by repeating practice problems. Now, before I talk about the pros and cons of studying via practice problems, I want to talk a little bit more about flashcards. Sometimes you have to get a little creative with flashcards when you make them. I feel like the most common and easiest flashcards to make are definition flashcards. For example, say you're taking an English class and you need to remember the meaning of the word erudite. Usually you'd put the word on one side of the flashcard and the definition on the other. In case you didn't know, the word erudite means learned or knowledgeable. This is the simplest form of flashcards and is great for brute memorization. However, you can also use flashcards for increasingly complex concepts. When trying to remember a more complicated definition, which doesn't simply consist of a synonym, you can use the blank equals definition format. This is something I did a lot for the lecture portion of my anatomy and physiology classes in college. I would make a blank, put an equal sign, and then put the definition of the term I was trying to remember. An example is blank equals a stroke caused by bleeding in the brain. The answer to fill in the blank would be on the opposite side and would be a quote-unquote red stroke or a hemorrhagic stroke. With flashcards, you can even go as far as memorizing extensive lists of information using several fill-in-the-blanks on one card. As an example, I had to memorize the symptoms of exercise addiction. On one side of the card, I wrote out the list of symptoms, then chose key words to remove from the list. On the other side, I listed, in order, all of the key words I had removed from that list. This helped me memorize the entire list by reminding me of key parts of each of the symptoms. Having one key word for each of the symptoms made it much easier to remember the full symptom description and then recall it on exams. Now, flashcards, as much as I love them, have their limits. In my opinion, they are not ideal for studying math or physics, which, if we're honest with ourselves, is just math pretending to be a science. For both of those subjects, I use practice problems. I go back through past homework assignments, quizzes, and tests, pick out all of the problems that I got wrong or struggled with, and I rework them. If I ever get stuck, I do my best to solve it, check my answer, and if I don't understand why I got it wrong, or if I don't understand how I got it right, I find time to discuss the process with my professor. It's true that we want to get the right answers, but more important than that is knowing how to get the right answers. Because if we memorize all of the right answers to the problems we practice but have no idea how to get that answer, we won't be able to answer similar but different questions on tests moving forward. With both math and physics, if you have a solid understanding of the underlying concepts, then solving the problems based on those concepts should be relatively simple. This is not always the case, but it most often is. Also, bonus tip, if you come across any trick questions, make sure you know how to solve them because they will most likely show up on exams. Now, this podcast is largely geared towards school and doing well in classes, but I also just had a thought about standardized testing that I want to share. Now, I'm fairly certain we all utterly despise standardized testing. If for some reason you don't, either you never had to take a standardized test, or you're one of the people who created them. Jokes aside, if you don't hate standardized tests, let me know in the comments. I'm curious to know your reasoning. Anyway, in my opinion, the best way to prepare for standardized tests is the following method, which helps me score well on every standardized test I've ever taken, including the GRE. Firstly, you should start preparing for the test at least a month before, if you can. If not, the steps you take will more or less be the same, just done in a condensed time period. The first thing you want to do to study is take a practice quiz with the same time limits as the real thing. Score it, and see where you struggled. Make notes of the concepts you struggled with and why you missed the problem. If it was just a silly mistake, that's your cue to double-check your work. If it was something you genuinely don't understand, look up the concept behind that problem and learn how to solve it. After you take the practice test, you're going to do practice problems targeting your weaknesses. Khan Academy is an incredible free resource for test prep and learning difficult concepts. I would highly recommend it. No, this is still not sponsored. Then, you're going to take another practice test, again under standard testing conditions and time limits, or as close as you can get it. You're going to do this over and over until you've covered just about every weakness you've found in the practice tests you've taken. Voila! That's how you study for a standardized test. What about when you're actually taking the test? Show up early. Make sure you bring water and a snack if that's allowed for during breaks, otherwise don't bring it. Make sure you have number 2 pencils, sharpeners, a calculator, if it's allowed, and anything the test tells you to bring with. If you've studied well and they didn't make a super hard test that year, you should be able to more or less breeze through it and have time remaining to check your answers. In order to breeze through it, mark questions that you aren't immediately sure how to approach. Choose an answer. You'll usually have about a 1 in 4 or 25% chance of getting it right if you just choose randomly. Then come back to it after you've finished all of the other questions. Even if you were 1,000% certain about your answers the first time around, make sure you filled in the right bubble, because if you know the correct answer but fill in the wrong bubble, the Scantron reader doesn't know the difference. During this time, attempt to solve any problems you didn't immediately know how to solve earlier, and if you end up having to just take a guess, make your best guess and call it a day. This has been some unsolicited and unexpected standardized testing advice from yours truly. Now, back to regular study habits. A study tactic that I don't personally use, but others find it helpful, is called blurting. This is when you take a blank piece of paper and write down anything and everything you can remember about the subject you're studying. When you can't think of anything else, or if you use a timer and you run out of time, go through your notes and see what concepts you missed or didn't explain thoroughly or correctly. This can help inform your studying. In a few of my high school classes, I remember the teachers making us do this. Personally, I hated it. It was just not the best studying method for me. For me, the knowledge is all there in my brain, but if you don't prompt me to properly recall it, I won't be able to access it. This is why I use flashcards. The flashcards prompt me to remember a specific concept, and then I can recall it just fine. Plus, unless you have genuinely horrible teachers, they'll ask you questions on a test to specifically elicit certain answers. They don't just hand you a blank test and say, okay, go. I will say that for open-ended and essay questions, blurting is a good practice, and I do use it then. As an example, for my high school history classes, we had standard questions about historical facts, but we also had to write usually 2 or 3 essays on our tests about a certain historical event, person, invention, etc. To prepare for those essays, we were given sample prompts that were very similar to the actual essay questions we would see on the exam. While studying, I would write out a spur-of-the-moment essay, then go back and revise it, and make notes on what aspects of the historical event or fact I forgot. For English classes, we also had to write essays for our finals, so I made sure to practice writing essays beforehand in a style similar to blurting. Another study method I don't use, but other people find helpful, is mind mapping. This is where you put the topic you're studying in the middle of a page and then connect various topics to it. This is a great visual way to see how various subtopics all connect to each other and the main topic. I like visuals, but mind mapping has never really been for me. If you use mind mapping, let me know in the comments how you use it and why you like it. These are all the main study tips I could think of. As always, please feel free to share what works for you so we can all learn and grow together. I hope you enjoyed this episode of ScholAceStic. In the next episode, I will discuss annotating. Work hard, take care, and I'll talk to you in the next episode.